All right, good afternoon. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Assalamu alaikum, and may peace and blessings be upon you all. Welcome everyone. My name is Mohammed Gamrawi. I'm the Senior Program Coordinator at the Mohsen and Fazia Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies at Florida International University. On behalf of the Jaffer Center, I'd like to welcome everyone to our event today. Today's lecture is part of our Khalid and Diana Mirza Distinguished Lecture Series. We would like to send a warm thank you to the Mirza family for their gracious support. We're also very grateful for the co-sponsorship of the Ruth K. and Shepherd Broad Distinguished Lecture Series, the Coalition of South Florida Muslim Organizations, the Irshad Center, the Islamic School of Miami, the Islamic Foundation of South Florida, Pak American Association of South Florida, Muslim Communities Association, the Islamic Jafariya Association, and the Jaffer Institute for Interfaith Dialogue and Education at Miami-Dade College. With that, I would like to welcome you all to this virtual event discussing Islam and Muslims in America. What is the history of Muslims in America? When did Muslims first arrive in the US? And how have they been members of society? What is the future outlook and possible challenges that Muslims face in the United States? Here to help answer these questions, I'm very excited to have with us today world-renowned expert and esteemed scholar, Dr. Saeed Hussein Nasser, University Professor at the George Washington University. Also joining us to provide commentary and insight are Dr. Mohsen Jaffer, founder of the Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies at FIU, and Dr. Asha Sabhani, board member of Cosmos and board member of Zaytuna College. Throughout this event, I'd like to welcome you, the audience, to please ask us your questions, send us your questions through the chat box. We will have a Q&A session later on in the segment, so please send us your questions and we will answer as many as we can. And now, without further ado, here to help me introduce our guest speaker is Dr. Mohideen Mesbahi, the founding director of the Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies.
Thank you, Muhammad. Salam to everybody and peace and welcome to all in the name of God, the most compassionate and the most merciful. Before introducing Dr. Nas, I would also like to express my special thanks to Khalid and Diana Mirza for the sponsorship of this important lecture and their continuous and valuable support for the Jaffer Center. I would also like to thank both Dr. Jaffer and Dr. Sabhani for accepting my invitation to participate in today's event. They both know our guest lecturers, Dr. Nas, very well. It would be very difficult to introduce Dr. Nas in only a few minutes, though he has asked me to be very brief. Dr. Saeed Hussein Nas is University Professor of Islamic Studies at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. After graduating from MIT with bachelor's in physics, he received a master's in geophysics and a PhD in the history of science, both from Harvard University. In 1958, Dr. Nasser returned to Iran to teach Islamic philosophy at Tehran University, where he later served as Vice Chancellor and Dean of the Faculty of Letters. Dr. Nas was the first Muslim to deliver the prestigious Gifford and Cadbury Lectures and was inducted to the Library of Living Philosophers in 2000. In November 2008, Dr. Nas spoke on behalf of the Commonwealth delegation at the first seminar of the Catholic Muslim Forum in the Vatican, where he met with Pope Benedict. Dr. Nas has published over 50 books and 650 articles on Islamic science, Islamic philosophy, comparative religion, Islamic ecology, environmentalism, and Islamic art and Sufism. Some of his publications include, most recently, the Study Quran as his editor-in-chief, Religion and the Order of Nature, Man and Nature and the Garden of Truth, The Vision and Promise of Sufism, and one of my favorite who I've used a lot with young people, A Young Muslim's Guide to the Modern World. Dr. Nas has been a familiar name and face for FIU faculty and students. He has been a gracious guest lecturer in the past, most recently last month at the International Conference on Ecology and Spirituality at FIU's Green School, where he delivered a lecture on the Islamic perspective on the environmental crisis. Today, Dr. Nas will speak on Islam and Muslim experience in America and will reflect on its past, present, and its future dynamics and prospect. Dr. Nas, welcome and thank you for joining us. The Zoom floor is yours.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dr. Miswahi, thank you very much. You're like my son, and whenever you invite me to say something, I can never refuse. I wish you well, and I hope this conference that you're organizing, which is a very important one at this juncture, will be successful and be able to guide and help people, not only those who are your direct students, but people elsewhere. When Dr. Misbah asked me to give this really short talk, it's going to be only 30, 35 minutes, he said I should limit it to that. On such a vast subject, I thought, what should I emphasize most of all? Because what happened in the past affects what happens now, and what will happen now will affect, of course, what will happen in the future. What happens now will affect what will happen in the future. So they're already interlinked together. Let me therefore begin from the beginning. Just a few sentences. In one sense, Islam seems to be a new phenomenon in America. But archaeologically and historically, if you dig into the past enough, you will discover that most likely before Columbus, Muslims of West Africa had already discovered something, at least, of the east coast of North America. And we have maps of classical Islamic geographers which depict in a fairly exact fashion the western coast of the Atlantic Ocean, which was then totally unknown to European geographers. And of course, as you know, for that reason, Columbus thought he was going to the East Indies when he was coming to America, in fact. Then comes the discovery of America by the white man, and by Columbus, and later on, the first colonies of white people in both what is today the southern part of the United States, and of course of Cape Cod, and with the Pilgrims in Massachusetts in the 17th century, and especially in the South, from the earliest period, even in the 16th century, when the first white presence was seen in North America, there were black people, probably all of them as slaves, or most of them as slaves, from West Africa, many of whom were Muslims. And there have been archaeological discoveries in South Carolina, places like that, from the 17th century, with small dolls or human figurines with of men with turbans, definitely that of Muslim model for those figurines. And there were also Muslim names among certain early slaves. People have worked on that. There are special scholars now in Islam and among African Americans in America, going back historically. There are major scholars now working on this who know much more about it than certainly I do. But it's important to remember that there is a Muslim presence, although many of these slaves were forced to be converted into Christianity, both in North America and in South America under somewhat different conditions. Nevertheless, something remained of their heritage. Occasionally we hear a name that is Arabic among the slaves. And this lasted until the 19th century, when Islam seems to have disappeared, even among the people brought from Africa, among the slaves. And certainly there was no Islam among the whites that we have any sign of. And the history of Islam in America really begins in the 20th century with a very mysterious, enigmatic figure called Farad, who appears and teaches Ali Jah Muhammad about Islam, and Ali Jah Muhammad becomes black. He was African American. He was a black leader of Muslims, but in order to confront and oppose the extreme forms of racial prejudice that existed at that time, he, in a sense, does the reverse, which is something also very anti-Islamic, and declares that Islam is a religion for the blacks, not for the whites, and sought the Nation of Islam, a movement which was Islamic but not theologically orthodox, in which was a kind of reverse racism that was then very virulent and still is in America. And anyway, he assembled a number of people around him. His son was in Chicago, and one of his lieutenants, Louis Farrakhan, is still alive, although he's very sick now. And the movement became very popular among a number of blacks, and there was a lot of conversion to Islam at that time. But his most charismatic and important lieutenant was the famous Malcolm X, who began as his lieutenant, a very brilliant man, intelligent and active, and then after a while, he broke away from the Nation of Islam ideology and converted again, you might say, to Hanafi Islam, to Orthodox traditional Sunni Islam. Malcolm X is a very important figure for the understanding of Islam in America, even for us who, like people like myself and probably most of my audience who come from the subcontinent or Iran or Syria or Iraq or someplace like that in the Middle East. It's very important to understand. I know him personally in 1960, in the 1957, 58, around there. Once I was asked by NBC, I was then president of the Harvard Islamic Society, to do an interview with him, which I did. And they asked me if I found him to be a Muslim, and I could not say, no, he's not, because everything that I said, he affirmed in an Islamic way, sometimes, of course, with different interpretations, but there's nothing I would say was anti-Islamic. And he did not say that whites cannot become Muslims, which was the doctrine taught by, or idea taught by Ali Muhammad. Anyway, and then when I was Al-Khan professor at the American University of Beirut in 1964, he had gone to the Hajj and came to Beirut. We spent 3 weeks together, in which we spoke extensively almost every day, had meals together every day, and I came to know him very well. And I consider his assassination one of the major tragedies, not only for Black Africans in America, but also Islam in America. Of course, as you know now, he's making a major comeback among many, not only African-American Muslims, but African-Americans in general. A lot of people who are now adopting Muslim names among African-Americans are not even Muslims. It's because of the heroic image or vision of this quite remarkable man, Malcolm X, who appeared among them. Parallel with that, with the appearance of about the same decades of appearance of Ali Muhammad in Chicago and Malcolm X, and of course Farrakhan, other people, and among the African Americans, the migration of Muslims to America increased exponentially. Several events caused that, including the war in Lebanon, of course, the Iranian Revolution that came later on that brought over 1 million Iranians, most of whom are Muslims, to America, especially the Los Angeles area, but also a continuous migration of Pakistanis and Indians and Bangladeshis, the whole subcontinent of India, the old India, from Pakistan to Bangladesh, and everything in between, but especially Muslims, more than Hindus. Now there are a lot of Hindus, but at first, mostly, I would say over 50% were Muslims, although the population of the subcontinent of India, of course, is mostly Hindu. But anyway, from that region, a large population began to migrate to this country. And until about 1970, we had a period of intense migration, and that continued then again for a few more decades into the beginning of the 21st century. And so you began to get a large population of Muslims in America, ethnically consisting primarily of Indo-Pakistanis, of Persians, of Arabs, of an old Albanian community in Illinois and Michigan and those areas, and some from African American countries like Nigeria and places like that, but not many. There, Muslims among the African Americans were the descendants of the slaves in this country who had been brought from Africa a long time before, not during this period of which I'm speaking. And so there was a new history, you might say, or page of the history of Islam in America that begins really from the 1970s on. And you get, first of all, a lot more feeling of presence of Muslims in America from local things such as, let's say, restaurants that are Pakistani or Indian or Bangladeshi and so Bengali and so forth and so on, to shops and places like that. And also parallel with that, a very important phenomenon takes place from that time on, but slowly. That is the training of a number of Muslim scholars in the field of Islamic studies who gradually begin to not take over completely, but at least to share in the explanation of Islam to America. This is a very important phenomenon. I've been speaking about it for decades. And I want to open a parenthesis right here because it concerns the future. And many of you are either parents or going to become parents of young men and women, addressing the Muslim families. We should always learn lessons from everybody that we can. But we can learn a very important, especially from the Jewish community in this country. You all know that a community of 5.5 million people, what tremendous influence it exerts in not only business, but in the arts, in politics, in so many different fields. Perhaps putting agriculture aside, there are only 4,000 Jews in the whole state of Iowa. Almost every other field, the Jews play a very important role, from medicine to music and everything in between. This is a remarkable achievement. The early Jewish community who had come to America in the early decades of the 20th century, they didn't do this. What happened was that when the rise of Nazism in Germany became felt, you had waves and waves of Jewish immigrants who fled the horrors of Nazism and came to America. And most of them were not Einstein. He was an exception. Yes, he was in that wave. Most of them were small shopkeepers. Very similar to the class from Pakistan and India, which migrated to America in the decades I was talking about. Not that the Persian migration different, because after the Iran Revolution, and many of the wealthiest and most educated Persians came to America. But the Pakistani Indian, for the social class and profession and so forth is concerned, was very similar to the Jews who migrated from Europe, although the causes are very different. Alhamdulillah, there was no Hitler in Pakistan and India to force them. It was economic, rise of population, all kinds of factors, mostly economic, that brought them to this country. Anyway, what happened was that the Jewish community once settled here, selling glasses on Fifth Avenue and the 40th Street, a little shop here, a little shop there. It's remarkable what intelligence they used. They trained their children, if they had 2 or 3 sons, one to become a rabbi or do Jewish studies, one to study medicine, one to study economic matters, depending on the gift of children and diversity. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that the families realized that to be a viable and surviving religious community in America, they had to train rabbis. German rabbis brought from Germany, yes, they were there, but that was not enough. They had to train rabbis who knew the American cultural scene, who could train younger generation of Jews in their own religion, but in a language that would be understandable to them. And they succeeded remarkably. If you look at the field of Jewish studies, besides the fact that as soon as the Jewish community became wealthy, it established one chair of Jewish studies after another in American universities. Tens and tens and tens, and they still do, of chairs of Jewish studies. But what is interesting is if you look at it, all of the important ones are occupied by Jewish scholars. No exception. Seton Hall was the last place, and recently the old professor was Catholic, he had left. I've heard that a Jewish professor has been employed there. That's a remarkable achievement, and I'm all in favor of it. I think Christianity should be taught by Christians, Hinduism by Hindus, Judaism by Jews, but also Islam by Muslims. But we are way behind in this matter, way, way behind. So we are in a situation in which we have a presence in this country, and Muslims are very successful in a field such as economic activity. We have a lot of very successful Muslim businessmen and women. They're very successful in medicine. A remarkable number of very, very good doctors. Right here in Washington, where I live, there are 600 and some Persian doctors who have to show up the whole of medicine in Washington. Look at the heads of hospitals, major surgeons, and then there are Egyptians, there are Pakistanis, there are other major doctors all over the United States. They're very successful in the field of medicine. As I said, they're very successful in certain forms of business, but we're not at all successful in, we're zero practically, is in our political influence. I say practically because now there are one or two Americans who have become Muslims who have become members of Congress or Attorney General or so on and so on. But it's very low, very, very low. I do not accept the present day Pew Charitable Trust estimation that there are 3.5 million Muslims in America. 40 years ago, Pew Charitable Trust said there are about 6 million Muslims in America. If anything, the number of Muslims has not gone down. We might be behind in other things, but not in producing human beings. The Islamic world is not, you cannot conceive of population becoming half in the United States, where migration has taken place, children have been born, and so forth and so on. And so I believe that at least we have 6 to 7 million Muslims in America. It's a very important minority. We carry our weight, as I said, from an economic point of view, and in certain fields, such as field of medicine. But we are practically zero when it comes to the domain of politics, and we've allowed Islamophobia to spread in America in the last few decades in terrible ways, terrible ways. Not all of it, of course, the fault of the Islamic community, but the fact that there's not enough response is the fault of the Islamic community. There's no doubt about that. It's our own fault. So we're in a situation which is a great challenge. A society like that of the United States, which was always open to various religions, in which nevertheless every new religion faced a challenge. When the Catholicism first came in the 19th century, the Protestants were against it. Greek Orthodox came in the end of the 19th century, the Catholics and Protestants were against it. The Jewish community came, the Christians were against it. Anti-Semitism. So it's not new, it's not new. But after all the positive steps that have been taken during the last 50 years of creating better relations between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, despite the problem of Israel, despite the fact that there were some Jewish influence that did not want to have this friendship, there were also some Muslim ones. Despite all of these, a lot of very positive steps were taken. God knows how many conferences I've participated in myself with Jewish rabbis, Rabbi Schorsch, other very famous rabbis in New York, on Islamic-Jewish dialogue, and there are many others. Despite all of that, Now you have a kind of undoing of these events and the rise of Islamophobia, which is a challenge. I don't think it's going to last very long, but provided the Muslims continue to live as Muslims and also be vibrant in their acceptability, open arm policy, which Islam has always displayed towards the other religions, especially Abrahamic religions. As Islam has been home to millions of Christians and Jews for 1400 years. During the very period when Europe carried out the massacres of Spain, of Holland, the Netherlands, the biggest one in the 20th century of Germany, and all the history of Europe is full of the blood of Jews and in Spain of Muslims when the Catholic kingdom was able to capture Granada and the south of Spain. Anyway, we Muslims have a very positive heritage from which we can benefit in this context. But the question comes up, and with this, since I don't have that much time, I only have a few minutes left, I want to ask ourselves this question. What about the future? What policy should we follow? In the history of our civilization, we've had situations in which Muslims have gone to countries in which there have been minorities and in which they have kept as minorities without participating in the political and social life of the majority community. We've also had cases in which Muslims have been minorities in other civilizations and societies in which they have participated in the political and social life of the community. The first instance of it is, for example, the Muslims in Finland. They've been there for over 1,000 years. You never hear of a major Muslim political figure in Finland. There have been a few local people, but not anyone famous. The second case is the Muslims in China. When they first landed in Nanking at the time of the Prophet, for the next 1,400 years, there have been the presence of Islam in China. There have been periods in which Muslims have been admirals, wazirs, governors, and so forth. There have been other periods when they've been ostracized and put aside and opposed and persecuted. Yes, but there have been those periods. There have been those periods. So the question comes up, what should we do? I know devout and very well-meaning Muslims who want to follow the first alternative, and I know devout and very good Muslims who want to follow the second alternative. But as a person who was educated early in America before I went back to Iran, and then I'd become exiled in this country for several decades, I want to know a little bit about Western history and a little bit about our own tradition, Islamic tradition. I believe that the situation of America being what it is much better to follow the second alternative, to try to participate in the political process. We're not going to be able to change the macro laws of this country, but we will be able, if we have political power, to help preserve laws which are at least less anti-Islamic, which at least allow space within which various aspects of Islam can be practiced. This is a very important issue. Dr. Misbah himself is a person who deals with Islamic politics, and he's written about this, and others are specialists. I'm not a specialist in Islamic politics. I know a little bit about Islamic thought, classically, but I also know a little bit about the West, and I am putting these experiences together, although I myself, to be honest with you, do not participate in political processes as I'm in exile now. There have been many, many proposals of all kinds to me. I want to devote my life to scholarship. With the gifts that God has given me, I think I can serve best in that field. But so I don't want to be wa'ad bala muta'ad, as we say in Arabic, a preacher who doesn't practice what he preaches. The same thing as you have in English, the proverb. But in this particular point, I believe that those who can, those who have the gift, not everybody has a gift to be a political figure, should participate all the way from simply voting for this or that position or law or so forth, to try to participate actively in the political life. There are states like Florida, for example, like New York, in which there's a very large concentration of Muslims, of course, in Southern California. But California is a very big state, 24 million people in it. But in certain regions where the Muslims can, in fact, even become mayors, local council heads, and so forth and so on. I don't say they're going to become president of the United States immediately, although Obama, technically, from the point of Islamic law, since his father was a Muslim, he's a Muslim, but he was a Christian. He professed Christianity, had a Muslim name, Barak, which the word Barakat in Persian. But that's unlikely to happen. But we could have even a couple of voices in the Congress or in the Senate or in high levels of the executive branch of the US government, could have a very important effect upon the future of Muslims in this country. But perhaps it's because of the fact that I am a university person and I'm in the field of scholarship, but I feel the most important step for the future of Muslims in this country is to be able to present Islam Islamically to the American world, not only by living as good Muslims, but also by being able to teach it and therefore occupy positions of Islamic studies in American universities. So let me conclude in thanking Dr. Misbahi for giving me this opportunity by saying that, of course, the best way to spread Islam and to guarantee its continuity in life is to be a good Muslim, not to talk about Islam, but to be a Muslim, to be a full Muslim, to follow the example of the Prophet, not just talking about it and quoting verses, but living it. And living it, and I hope, inshallah, and I'm very optimistic from this point of view, the Islamic community will have a much better future than it does now, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you, Dr. Nasser, for giving us that rich history of Muslims in America. And I think you bring up some very important dynamics that Muslims need to be prepared for and also practice in this country. So you've definitely given us a lot to talk about during the Q&A section. But before we do that, I'd like to go ahead and open up to Dr. Muslim Jaffer for some commentary and to provide a few remarks. Dr. Jaffer, please.
Thank you, Mohammed. We begin by invoking the name of that loving Lord who is so kind and merciful. Dr. Nasser, it's good to see you again, albeit on Zoom. But the last time we met, you came to Miami on invitation of the Rumi Society. Our stalwart and a great founder here, Brother Muhammad Shakir, it was a precursor of Cosmos, which we will tell you about, and Dr. Sabhani will tell you more about, that we realized that we need to do something. And then you were invited to come, and we met about 10, 12 years ago. But, and unfortunately, you said something about our numbers. It is really surprising that our numbers are lower than they were before. And the Islam of the slaves was eradicated, but non-Europeans were not allowed to come to America until mid-1960s, thanks to President Johnson and the Congress. And before that, Muslims were not coming. That's why our numbers are so low, even though we make 1/4 of the humanity. But we as Muslims who came here and are successful and have integrated, we made some mistakes. So we didn't do something very well. Like number one, we didn't convey to our fellow Muslims that Islam is a way of life, where the cardinal requirement is that you're a good human being, you're God conscious. The other thing, we didn't let our fellow Americans know that Allah is not an alien God. You know, like even a 4-star general called him a moon god of Arabia, that Allah is just a name for God, the God. And he's the same God of Abraham, Adam and all the prophets, all the 120,000, finally with the Prophet of Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this message we have not done a very good job of. And finally, we didn't do civic engagement, political engagement, introducing Islam in the academic area. You're right. We excelled a lot in the professional fields of medicine and science and so on, but we have not done such a good job in the academics. But the good news is that, for example, like the precursor, we had Rumi Society, but then we formed Cosmos, where we engage with the political leaders, academic areas, and make a case for how Islam is part and parcel of America. And we as Americans make very good fabric of the society. And they've done a good job in that. And also, like one of the 5 pillars of Islam is charity. And I think Muslims have done, especially here in local area, done a very good job. We have a free clinic for last 10 years for everybody. We do a battered women's home and charity in disasters and in school openings and helping children to get to school and give them, feed the homeless and so on. So we have been doing our charity work. So what I find heartening is that Muslims are finally realizing that they have to vote. With credit to Dr. Misbahi, in the late 1990s, he invited Dr. Esposito and a lot of Muslim scholars from all around the world, I mean America, to come and talk to Muslims to say it's about time you got involved politically, because Muslims just put their nose to the grind wheel and didn't bother about politics and just did their own profession or studies or whatever, and were not involved politically. Really, we were completely disengaged. And he brought the scholars down, and up to today, there are some pockets of our Muslim society who don't believe they should vote. It's sad, but that engagement has started, and we even have now a very robust organization called Engage, which tries to get people to register to vote and to vote, whatever political leanings, it doesn't matter, but to participate and cast their vote, because all politics are local, and to get to know who's their commissioner, who is their school commissioner, who is in PTA, and who's teaching their children, what's happening to their society at large in and around their own community. That has been a very positive move. So I am very confident. Thank you for telling us our journey, but our journey has just started because we were late entrants to America in the late 60s, and probably more of us came in 70s. Our fellow Muslims and our fellow Americans are also reverting and realizing what a beautiful faith this is. So I'm confident with the academic activity, with the activity of our fellow Muslims, we want to start a conversation, an engagement, and make our fellow Americans realize who are Muslims, because you're right, there's tremendous Islamophobia and misinformation and disinformation about who Muslims are, because there are a lot of characters who represent a very bad picture of who Muslims are today. Unfortunately, if these efforts prevail, we need to inform all our fellow Americans who we really are, and I'm sure they'll all fall in love with us. Thank you for being here, and thank you for organizing this project. And in the end, I will say thank you to Brother Khalid Mirza and Diana for organizing this. God bless you all.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Jaffer. You bring up such an important point. I know there was a survey done not too long ago that said the majority of Americans actually don't know a Muslim. And those that did know a Muslim tended to have more favorable views of Muslims and Islam. So I think it's a very important point that you bring up, that we also need to get out there and be the ambassadors for Islam. With that, I'd like to go ahead and move next to Dr. Asha Sabhani for her remarks and commentary. Dr. Sabhani.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin abdika wa rasulika al-Nabi al-Ummi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum and greetings to everyone. I wanted to just thank, it's really an honor to share a platform with someone as esteemed. I mean, we're basically talking, or have with us a polymath, a living polymath with us, with Dr. Nasser. I was in middle school when you came to Florida, and I saw you last at the Reviving the Islamic Spirit Conference in Toronto, and your talks are always something that are just inspiring. And it's amazing because of the articles and the books that you've written. Many of those are just timeless pieces. And some of the ones that I would recommend that are pertinent to the topic are Religion and the Environmental Crisis, The Heart of Islam, Enduring Values for Humanity, and my favorite, which is The Young Muslim's Guide to the Modern World. So for those in our audience, those are great books and articles for you to look up and to read. But just to comment on your wonderful talk, I think one of the things that you have taught us, and when you read the history of Islam in various regions, when Muslims have come into different areas, that we have integrated in many cultures and societies, and Islam brings with it sacred truths and a tradition. It elevates the culture of the land when it's in harmony with those truths, and then it refines those aspects that are not in harmony with the divine or with the sacred. And that's why when you travel throughout the Muslim world, we see such a diversity in cuisine, language, arts, dress, culture, and that's a phenomenon. And in the United States, I believe it's the same. I think Dr. Nasser is right on about the numbers. We're definitely more than 3 million. We have an impact. And as Dr. Jaffer says, that we still have a journey ahead of us. And one of the things that I would say is that one of the things that we're seeing in our society here, just in the United States, is that there is a sickness. There is an ailment. People are suffering, and they're suffering on various levels. We have environmental suffering. We have spiritual suffering. We have a family crisis. We have a crisis in ethics and in commerce and trade, because you have people with the wealth gap and the disparities, people really suffering in severe poverty, and then you have an amassment of wealth that is unprecedented. So we have all of these problems, and as Muslims, we have a tradition, we have a way of life, we have values that can really provide solutions to these. And this is where, as Dr. Nasser said, we have to be creative. We have wonderful physicians that have now started free clinics, and inshallah there'll be, God willing, there'll be hospitals also that will be notable in the world. We have people that are engaging in developing soup kitchens and food banks and all of these things to serve, to help those that are impoverished, that are suffering. We have people that are engaging in all sorts of very interesting and innovative nonprofits and NGOs to help the environmental crises. And so what we're seeing basically is when there is a removal of traditional values, then you have an element of suffering. And I think that our community definitely has a role to play. In terms of the politics, where we are very young children in this country when it comes to politics as a Muslim community, but we do have hope because we have organizations now that are mobilizing people to vote and to exercise their right to vote and to engage, not just in the national elections, which of course is very important, but also locally, getting involved in the school board and city councils. We have young Muslim men and women that are actually running for office. They're bright, they're talented, they have a lot to offer. So these are good steps that are coming forward. But we also have to be wise about our engagement. One of the things that I think we have to be careful of and wary of is this kind of tendency where we attack one another if we don't agree on a certain political issue. We have to be able to understand that there will always be differences. In the history of the Muslim world, or in the world at large, there's always been differences, but we have to have an open discourse and dialogue of mutual respect and understanding, not personal attacks and trying to bring other people down. So that's very important. And then lastly, just I wanted to say is that our participation politically, we have to remember that political parties and platforms are going to change. The Republican Party was not the same 20 years ago, and it's not going to be the same 20 years from now. The same with the Democratic Party. So our influence has to be beyond just a political party. It has to be well integrated. And that's something that we can learn from the Jewish community that really has a footprint in all avenues. They're not just affiliated with one group or one political party or an influencer or these things. They have a footprint in all areas, and they exert their influences with intelligence and strategy. And I think that for us, that's our next step. So for all of us out there, please vote and get involved and use your talents, whatever your God-given talents are, to really improve the condition of the community, inshallah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Sabhani, for those remarks. I'd like to go ahead now and open it up for our Q&A session. We have some really great questions coming in from the audience. Since you kind of touched on politics and Muslims being involved in politics, I think a good starting point would be there, and Muslim involvement in the political system here in this country. I think sometimes we see sort of these converging viewpoints. You have sometimes the more immigrant or older generation that migrated here that tend to say things like, don't vote in this country, or tend not to be politically involved. And now we have what's coming of age into a younger, more, I would say, Muslim American, those who are first generation Americans born here and want to be politically involved. We started seeing politics in the United States change this past election cycle. We've had people like Ilhan Omar elected to Congress, Rashida Tlaib elected to Congress. So I'd like to maybe start with Dr. Nasser and what your viewpoint is on this. Do you see Muslims becoming more involved in the political system? We have one question here, if you're able to tie this in, from Mohammed Al-Mutari, who said, do you believe there will ever be an American Muslim Supreme Court justice in the future of Muslims in this country? I know you touched a little bit on possibly having a Muslim president, or if that may or may not happen. But I'm just curious if you could tie that in. Do you see a changing dynamic with Muslims becoming more politically involved, getting elected to these positions of office, such as Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib? And will that continue? I mean, I think we're seeing more Muslims now running for office in localities like California, in New York, in Florida. So do Muslims have a bright future in influencing politics in the media?
The answer, simple terms, yes, but there's more involvement than that. You have in America the idea of the separation of church and state. The activity that people perform in the state are supposed to have nothing to do with what they do or what they believe as far as the church is concerned. But of course, human beings are not like that. On one side influences the other, but the idea is very strong in the United States. So Ms. Omar, who's a Muslim, is supposed to be Muslim privately and have nothing, her Islam is not supposed to have anything to do with the public domain. This is a problem. It's a problem for Muslims because Islam is not only private practice, it's also a way of life, as we just said, and encompasses the whole of life. It's a very difficult matter. If, let's say, you're chosen as a member of Congress and Congress passes a law which is specifically against the Muslims of Ethiopia or Egypt, someplace like that, what do you do? Of course, you can cast a negative vote, but your counsel will bother you because you're participating in a process with which you really disagree. So it's going to be a challenge, but at the same time, that's inevitable. And it's a good thing because there are issues that come up in the Congress in which an Islamic voice being present can have a positive effect for the Islamic community in comparison with if we were to be absent. But I would not fool myself. I do not think, at least for the next generation, the possibility of a Muslim becoming a member of the Supreme Court, unless he puts away Islam. I mean, only be nominally Muslim. Because if you're actually a believing Muslim, which means you accept the Sharia, you accept the law of God, there's so many issues that come to the Supreme Court, which in fact are decided according to criteria which are not really religious in the Christian sense or Jewish sense or Islamic sense. Or sometimes they have a religious connotation from a Christian point of view, a very different one from the Islamic point of view, like the question of abortion. It's a complicated matter, I shall not go into. The question of is a fetus a human being? The answer of Islamic law is not the same as that of the Catholic Church. They both believe in the sacredness of the fetus after a certain period. But how much is that period? How many days, how many weeks, how many months? I will not get into that now, but there are issues of difference. So the last part of the question, I do not believe that is going to happen on the level of Supreme Court justices or even President of the United States or head of the Senate or something like that. But I think it will happen on one echelon below, let's say, maybe a member of the Senate, member of the House, perhaps one day even governor of some state. And at that time, then the problem will come up: how does one function in a society which believes in the separation of church and state? If one's religion has no effect on the state, what does it matter whether a person is a Muslim or not, on governor of Michigan, let's say? If it does have effect, what effect it will have? And I think that in this matter, again, I think certain small number of Jewish people have risen very high in political positions, have had to deal with. And one or two senators who are Jewish, in fact, certain issues came up in which they said openly that Jewish ethical teachings do not permit them to give this and that particular decision on that particular matter. Anyway, we have a very big challenge ahead of us. To summarize this again, there will be, I think, more participation of Muslims in the political life and members of Congress here and there, perhaps not on the highest levels of Supreme Court or presidency or vice presidency or something like that, but on the high level, nevertheless, and will have a lot of effect in the long run. But Muslims have to figure out how to go about doing it. How can it have an effect on a society which, in principle, believes in the separation of church and state?
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Nasser. I know it's a very complicated question, and I'm very happy you brought some of these factors up, because a lot of our questions are dealing with that. For instance, from Umar Rahman, he asked, how do you have the conversation with abortion in regards to church and state being separated? We also have another question from Shabir Motorwala. How should Muslims deal with the question of same-sex marriages in light of Sharia and US Constitution? So I'd like to sort of incorporate that into another question that we have from Asim Nabi. As being Muslims in this country, how can we pursue being a part of the community or neighborhood in a way that appeases American culture, but without sacrificing our own Islamic values? So Dr. Nasser, maybe we can start with you, and then I'll pose that same question for our commentators, Dr. Jaffer and Dr. Sabhani.
My first answer would be you can't. You can't. You must make a distinction between how Islam lived in India or China and what is happening today in America, in the sense that both Chinese and Indian traditional cultures were impregnated with religion, with religious values. The Hindus went to temples as often as Muslims went to churches, to mosques, excuse me. And similarly with China and other places where Islam went. Whereas in the West, whether it be in Western Europe or America where Islam is present, the local culture is not something that from which we can solve by appealing to our own historical past. When 500 years ago Bosnia and Albania became Muslim, they lived in a world surrounded by a very strong Christian tradition. People were Catholics, and it's a very different dynamic than being a Muslim in a neighborhood where most of the children probably receive no religious education from their parents, where many parents are divorced, where there are all kinds of things, promiscuity, things like that is going on. And so I would take a step backwards and say the first thing to do for Muslim parents is to make the home a Muslim place without hypocrisy, not just saying one thing and doing the other, but making the home a place where the child feels that there's a reality to Islam, not what his father or mother tell him, but what they do, so that their actions, their presence, even the presence of Islamic objects, of art, of literature, of poetry, all that, of course, the Quran, the Hadith, all that one can teach the child is Islamic. And then for them to realize that this neighborhood, these are nice children, they're very nice, they're your neighbors. The Prophet said you should respect your neighbors, but they are not sources to be copied. A child oftentimes copies from others, of course. Peer pressure is a famous English word. But at least to vaccinate the child against this pressure that is going to come up. Otherwise, we'll have what we have now, a tremendous crisis in many Muslim families. How many families I know myself, students who are very good Muslim students with me, who now have a 15-year-old daughter who's run away with a boy somewhere for 2 weeks, said that she is not heard from her. I receive calls like that all the time. We are in a crisis, there's no doubt about that. And the only thing we can do, we cannot change the American society at large. We cannot change the society which is now in big cities 20% atheist. More religious than Europe, but nevertheless, even religion is going down. And then promiscuity, immorality, since the 1960s, had just shot up like a meteor into the sky, as you all know. So what we have to do is to create a hearth, a center, the home, where the reality of religion at least can be experienced by the child. Not just talked about, but experienced on every level. And then try to help the child navigate his or her way by showing that, yes, you'll be kind to your neighbors, you can play football with them in the street, you can go to movies with them, but they belong to another culture, another religion, another worldview. You should not follow those things. In our religion, we do not drink. If they drink at the age of 13, don't copy them. It's very difficult, very, very difficult. I understand that. But that's the best that we can do. That's the best that we can do. It's a very difficult situation. If we can create for ourselves an Islamic cultural ambience, not an Indian or Pakistani cultural ambience inside the home and then American one outside, but an Islamic cultural ambience with which the younger generation can identify, both as an American, as a Muslim, we will have done a great deal. But even then, it's not so easy. The Jews succeeded in doing that. But how many Jewish students are atheists? Many of them. I have a lot of Jewish students, very brilliant, who are atheists, who left Judaism. Many of them come back, of course, but many of them have left. Many of them don't follow the halakha. They don't follow Jewish law. They don't follow Jewish morality. They do all kinds of things, like Christians do, like, I don't know, anybody else, a Mormon do, anybody else, like, but the society at large. So we have to be aware of what the world we're living in, and not to think the task is easy. The task is very difficult. A person who wants to become a parent and is a Muslim has to realize before God what responsibility is going to have. It's not like having a child in Yazd or Peshawar and grows up in a society automatically as a Muslim. The parents have a double responsibility, and it's not easy. It's very difficult, but it's not impossible. The very, very situation that we talk about. I know children of my students who are Americans who have become Muslims, who, mashallah, are being brought up as very good Muslims. They're very devout, as devout as any young Egyptian boy in Asyut in Egypt, even more so perhaps. And they're also inoculated against all of the negative elements that abound in the world in which they live.
Great, thank you, Dr. Nasser. Dr. Sabhani, would you like to add on to that?
I think what Dr. Nasser said is key, really, is that you have to start at the family, at the home first. I mean, there's so much rapid change that's happening. We're kind of in the information age. So now in Muslims in general, especially the youngsters, the music, entertainment, and all of these things, they're just very, unfortunately, very profane. So there's a rise of that sort of, a lot of the TV shows that you see now, there's a ridiculing of parents, especially the father figure. They kind of make fun of him like he's some, insignificant individual. And then the child is looked upon as the wise one and the parents are looked upon as the fools. So this is kind of an inversion of a reality, a metaphysical reality that, in the world, in Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and in Islam has always been there. So this is something that's happening worldwide, unfortunately. So we definitely have to inoculate our youth. One of the biggest concerns that I see also is the rise of atheism in the Muslim community. So you have youth that are growing up And issues like theodicy, like the problem of evil, will come up, or issues about the existence of God. And they'll go to college and they'll take a philosophy class, and all of a sudden they don't have any tools to answer these questions. And it's our fault because we have not trained them. We have not vaccinated them against these, what I would call them a doctor. So I'll say there are these pathogens that come in and they're infecting our community. And so we have to inoculate that. There's a lot of Abrahamic communities in the US that are also concerned, and they want to preserve that sort of Abrahamic morality as well. So I think just a community, like-minded individuals coming together, propagating those sorts of values, insulating the family to the sense that when you see these atrocious things, that you respond with something better and that you're able to keep your core identity. I think those are very key. And so that's what I think. But I think the core really is preserving the family unit.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Sabhani. Dr. Jaffer, your comments?
Yes, this is my personal view. I believe in the separation of church and state. In a simple distillation of what the fourth Caliph of Islam, Ali ibn Talib, wrote a letter to the governor of Egypt, because at that time Egypt was a cosmopolitan society of Christians, Jews, and a lot of other religions. And this governor was supposed to rule this very important state. And one of the things he wrote in his epistle was that, remember, these are your brothers in faith or brothers in humanity. Now that sentence resonates very strongly in my life. And I feel on that basis, we can separate church and state and do what's right for the state and keep my religion off and not wear it on my sleeve. And the second question was about same-sex relationship. I came to America with a very different opinion, feeling that this was horrible and bad, until I started treating all these AIDS patients. The hospital was full of these young men who had this horrible new disease. At that time, we didn't even have a name for it. And while treating them, you get to know them. And invariably, I got to know this, that none of them had chosen that way of life. They just felt it. And medically today, we know that this is not something chosen by the patients, maybe some, but most of them know. It is just innate. Now, I can't explain it because all the religious scriptures of all the different religions, all of them frown upon this practice. But using that epistle of the fourth Khalifa, that these are my brothers in humanity, I have to be forgiving and accepting and let God decide. But treat them as my fellow human beings and give them all the rights that they deserve as a fellow citizen in this country.
Can I interject, Mr. Moderator?
Of course.
I'm not an official panelist, but I've been living with these situations and questions repeatedly. And I teach classes on Islam and politics and so on. I think, to follow up what Dr. Jaffer said and what Dr. Nas initially talked about, the difficulty of public space, I think we have to identify what is the most significant issues in the public space now, anywhere, And if we have a practical answer to that questions, we can identify 1, 2, 3 major issues that humanity is facing, including Muslims in Egypt, including Muslims in Iran, including Muslims in Miami. Then we have to see what is the Islamic response to those crises. Does Islam has anything to say about that? I think this is the best and practical way to actually define the scope and the substance of public domain and the level of public conversation. Whether Muslims become politicians or they become social activists, they have to focus on that. What are the biggest problems? That the religion would tell them this is the problem. And second, what are you going to do about it? For example, I think, one of the field of Dr. Nasser's on environmental crisis, that's a huge global crisis with huge impact everywhere, economic, social, mental, everything. That Islam has a position on that. A public policy person can talk about that very effectively and run for the office or be social activists. How about the questions of economic justice as one of the most profound questions of the 21st century? And how small numbers of people, almost in any society now, monopolize the money and the power everywhere. And I would say practically they are all basically countryless. They really don't care about their own countries anymore. They are being disassociated mentally. They pay lip service to nationalism, but they're not really. They're part of an upper class. Those two questions, environmental crisis and social economic justice, without getting into theological debates about whether there is a hijab is good or hijab is bad or what is happening with sexuality, which I think, I'm not saying it's not important, but you might miss the point if you focus on those issues, and you can never resolve them. And I don't think this is the way religion actually has dealt with man and humanity. And this is Dr. Jafar mentioned Imam Ali's letter. Imam Ali's letter comes from his religious point of view. It's not in the reinventions of secularism. His secularity, if there is such a thing, is divine. He looks at human being as an archetype, respected and important, because God's to speak to human beings like that. Therefore, Ali does the same thing. Ali was very concerned about justice and equality. We should be concerned about that too. So I think the social space actually demands that type of conversation. Look at the race issue in this country. Who can answer that race question better than Muslims, you know? And then it comes to questions of the second part of my comment, that is, I'm going to ask maybe Dr. Nas to comment more. How do you create that cultural ambiance in your family? And you mentioned the connection between what you say and what you do. That's critical, obviously. I think that's one of the most important issues that most Muslim families, not only here, as Dr. Sabhani said, but everywhere else, are facing. And the reason they are facing the same condition, regardless of where they live, because they live under the same economic system, which is underwritten by fundamental injustice and search for money and accumulation. And Islam has a position on that. So I think the both public space and the conversation with the kids is not just about what is haram, what is halal in a typical way, but what is the Islamic view on fundamental issues of humanity today? And then as a Muslim young kids, they have an answer to those questions, and they can participate in public discussions properly without constantly thinking about responding to specific theological questions about this attitude or that attitude. That's my, and then I have a question for Dr. Nasr if he has time to answer them, and that will be if he can share more about his encounter with Malcolm X, as he mentioned in Beirut. You know, I'm really fascinated by that. I've never heard that before. So if it's time, of course it's not time, then that's okay. So that's my intervention. And then you have a couple of interesting questions from the Q&A that you wanna bring in if you want. You know. Absolutely. Especially the one from Shabir Kirmani, who's asking a question from Dr. Nasr. Anyway, I'm sorry that intervention wasn't planned, but I just came in.
No, please, Dr. Nasr, if you'd like to touch on that, we only have about 7 minutes left, so we can go ahead and fit that in, and then I'll do my best to try to plug in a few of the last-minute questions from the Q&A. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm glad to see our audience is very involved. But if you'd like to just touch on that for a few minutes, Dr. Nasr.
I agree with, first of all, I have also to go myself very soon. I thought it was going to end at 1 o'clock. They told me the 1 hour program, but anyway, I would just say a word about this. I'm very much in accord with what Dr. Misbahi said, and I just want to underline what he said about the letter of Hazrat Ali alayhi salam to the governor of Egypt. Ali spoke in a context in which everything was within a religious universe. It was not the question of secularism and religion. The question of what we do with people who deny God, not deny Islam, but deny God even in another religious form, or who deny the ethical foundations which derive from divine teachings, the revelatory conditions for ethics and so forth and so on. What you do with those people in your daily discourse is not to what Ali wrote to Malik Ashtar, governor of Egypt, that I wrote several letters which discuss these matters. The question of justice, as Dr. Misbah mentioned, is the same. Yes, Ali said there should always be justice. The governor should always be just. And if there were to be a Muslim governor for, let's say, California, which is mostly non-Muslim, he should also govern according to justice over the Christians and not only the Muslims of that state. Yes, that's true. But most of all is the question of thinking of justice as an attribute of God, of dealing with others as they are created by God. Now, if you try to normalize what is really a side effect of the human condition, numerically speaking, that is homosexuality, and reject the explicit teachings of all the religions, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Christ officially banned sodomy, so does the Quran. You have to have a choice. You have to make a choice between all the revelations of the world and this kind of humanism that is now taking over. Now, the Islamic world solved this matter. There were a lot of homosexuals in the Islamic world, relatively speaking, not 1 or 2% of your society. But they let them go. They were doing their own thing. But the question of breaking the norm for the sake of a marginal phenomenon, which is one of the conditions of modernism, it destroys norms in this way, is religiously devastating. To be kind to homosexuals is very good. To be generous with them, not to criticize them. That's between them and God. I agree with that. And Islamic law has made it very difficult, very difficult to legally penalize such men by having the need of several witnesses, which hardly ever occurs. That's why you look at the whole history of Islam. How many homosexuals are flogged according to the dicta of the Sharia for homosexuality, which in fact came from, or stoned or something like that. For adultery, the same adultery, that you have to have 4 witnesses. How many were there for in the 1400 years of a civilization that has 1.5 billion people in it and hundreds of millions in the days of old? Extremely rare. And so the fact that this question is now brought forward in this way, the Muslims have to respond to it, I believe, according to what Islam has always taught and practiced. A kind of tolerance on the basis that the law itself makes it very difficult to be intolerant. Unless somebody comes and brags about it like is happening today, but in traditional Islamic society that was not the case. And the hiding of one's sexual proclivities were not a psychological deprivation, as some people said, because there were always outlets that people found and people didn't talk about it. It was there. Anyway, I didn't want to get into this very complicated question, but it was forced upon me by the comment that was made before. But I want to come back to confirm what Dr. Misbahi said very strongly. And I hope very much that the questions that he posed, and most of them addressed to me, another occasion might arise where I should be very glad to answer them. But for today, I think I've said enough.
Thank you so much. So I think with that, we'll go ahead and just conclude the event. I'd like to thank everybody in the audience. I'm extremely sorry that we weren't able to get to some of these amazing questions that you all have provided. But hopefully we can have Dr. Nasser back again to discuss some of those more intricate questions. Once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Nasser. I'd like to also thank our panelists, Dr. Jaffer, Dr. Sabhani, as well as Dr. Masbahi, who also joined in. I'd also like to plug in that we will be having an event on Monday, October 19th, the Muslim vote in the 2020 elections. So please, I'll be sending that information for that event out later on today. Register. We hope that you can join us on Monday. I'd also like to thank all of our co-sponsors once again. And finally, to thank all of you in the audience for joining us here today. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.